Our next topic is point elasticity of demand. In many cases, we get a linear demand curve. A linear demand curve implies that there is a proportionate change between demand and price. So the curve is generally a straight line. And when the curve is in the form of a straight line, we can find the point elasticity. Now, point elasticity means finding the elasticity of demand from the demand curve at any point. At any point on the curve. It can be this point, it can be this point, this, or this point. But how do we find point elasticity of demand? By this formula, that is lower segment by upper segment. Lower segment, that is the segment getting formed by the axis and the point, by the x-axis and the point. Let's say the point is R here. So the lower segment here will be RT, and the upper segment here will be the segment formed by y-axis and the point, that is R with a smaller t. So lower segment by upper segment. Now let's, for our convenience, try to number this. Now let's divide this demand curve into 4 parts with the points U and S. Let's assume that the length of this demand curve is 8 centimeters. So each segment, that is ST, RS, UR and PU, gets broken into 2 centimeters each. Now we can find the elasticity at these points on the demand curve. You can find the elasticity at point capital T, or at point S, or at point R, or at point U, or at point small t. You can find elasticity at any of these points. How do we find it? How do we find it? It's by this formula. Lower segment upon upper segment. Let's assume that you have to find the elasticity at point S. So at point S, the lower segment will be S with a capital T, and the upper segment will be S with a smaller t. The length of the lower segment is 2, whereas the length of the upper segment will be 6. 8 minus this 2. So we can say at point S, the elasticity of demand is 1 by 3 or 0.33. Likewise, we can find the elasticity of demand at point R. At point R, we find the elasticity. Here the lower segment is R with capital T and the upper segment is R with a smaller t. The length of lower segment is 2 plus 2, that is 4. And the length of upper segment is again 2 plus 2, that is 4. So the elasticity at point R is 1. Likewise, we can find the elasticity at point U, at point capital T and at point small t. Now please bear in mind that elasticity at point capital T, that is on the x-axis, will always be 0, because here we do not have any lower segment. So lower segment becomes 0 and any number divided by 0 is always 0. So point elasticity anywhere on x-axis will always be 0. Again, point elasticity anywhere on y-axis will always be infinity. Why? Because here we do not have any upper segment, we only have the lower segment. So lower segment will be divided by upper segment, that is 0, and any number divided by 0 will always be meaningless or infinity. Now let's take a look at this diagram. This again is a case where we have a straight line demand curve being formed by the points small t and big T. Small t touches the y-axis and the capital T touches the x-axis. So, as we've discussed, the elasticity at point capital T will always be 0, because at point T we do not have the lower segment. So the elasticity at point D will always be 0. The elasticity at point L will always be less than 1. Why? Because at point L, the lower segment will always be shorter than the upper segment. So a smaller number divided by a bigger number will always give you a result of less than 1. So at any point which is nearer to the x-axis, the elasticity of demand will be less than 1. At point R, which is the midpoint on the demand curve, what will happen? Here the lower segment is equal to the upper segment. So when you divide two equals, it will always return with a answer of 1. You will always get 1. So elasticity at a midpoint on a straight line demand curve is always 1. Likewise, elasticity at point S will be greater than 1, because here the lower segment is bigger than the upper segment. The lower segment is bigger than the upper segment. You divide a number by a smaller number, you will always get an answer which is greater than 1. And finally, at point T, the elasticity, that is the point elasticity of demand, will always be infinity, because at this point you do not have any upper segment, and when the denominator is 0, you will always get the answer as infinity.